Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, and thank you so much for joining us today. France's president recently described NATO as being brain dead. Well, Russia's Vladimir Putin has certainly changed that perception, hasn't he? So why should we all care about what happens with NATO? Ukraine has certainly brought the alliance to the front page, to the forefront. But now let's hear from two experts about what they think is happening with NATO today and where it might go tomorrow. First, let me turn to Jeffrey Engel. He's the founding director of the Center for Presidential History and professor of history at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He is the author of a number of books, including one that is particularly relevant today, When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Coming to us from Durham, North Carolina, is Susan Colbourn. She's the Associate Director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies at Duke University, and she's got a new book coming out, Euromissiles, the Nuclear Weapons That Nearly Destroyed NATO. So let's get started and hear what they have to say. Jeff, let me turn to you first, because I saw that President Vladimir Putin just about a year ago in December gave a speech, and he certainly was outspoken. He said, speaking of the United States, they cheated us vehemently, blatantly. Then they said that NATO would not expand 1 inch east. Is he justified? Is he correct?
You know, I'm going to make this a complicated question, complicated, and then give you the simple answer, which is to say Vladimir Putin is referring there to a conversation that he had with Secretary of State James Baker in Moscow in February of 1990, where, excuse me, not him, Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, in which the two leaders, over the course of a several-hour conversation, one of the things that James Baker said as they were discussing the future of East Germany, remember the Berlin Wall had just fallen a few months before, future of East Germany, future of Germany, and the future of Europe, was to say, well, perhaps NATO won't expand to the East. And Gorbachev thought about that. And in the same conversation, James Baker said, you know, perhaps the Soviet Union would like to join NATO as well. And Gorbachev thought about that. And then the meeting ended. Baker immediately realized that he had made a terrible mistake because, and here's the technical part, by saying that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, that would not include East Germany, which was then in discussion to become part of Germany. So in essence, you might have a situation where the dividing line between security and not security would go right smack through the middle of a country. So essentially, the Americans never said this ever again. The Russians never really brought it up ever again until after the Cold War, when they were just disturbed by the expansion of NATO, and frankly, also disturbed by their difficult economic and geopolitical straits in the 1990s, and went looking for a scapegoat and found this line, if you will, in the documents. So what Putin is saying there is something which, yes, was said, but it was said as an offhand remark. And as James Baker, a lawyer, would tell you, if you don't get something written down and signed, it's not a contract. So Putin is really exacerbating his own energies and anxieties for the Russian people, and found one line to pin his hopes on.
And Jeff, it's very clear, too, that George H.W. Bush was against that.
Oh, you know, this is one of those funny diplomatic conversations that we have between the president and his secretary of state that we wish had been better recorded, because we know from the record that Ben Scowcroft, Bush's national security advisor, and James Baker had a heated discussion over the fact that Baker had made this obviously bonehead statement, and Baker admitted it immediately. He's like, you know what, that's right. In fact, if you want to go really deep into the history, Baker actually subsequently goes from Moscow over back to Canada for a meeting of another NATO meeting, and essentially it walks the issue back at that conference and says, you know, of course, we're going to include Eastern Germany in any future security arrangement. And this is all in the midst of massive negotiations at the end of the Cold War over the future of NATO, the future of Germany, future of Europe. So, you know, you can imagine a scenario where you've got months-long conversation. One line of an offhand remark by a diplomat should not.
And you know what's so interesting about this is we're talking about something that happened some 30 years ago. I want to get back to the enlargement of NATO in just a minute, because it is key to our discussion today. But Dr. Colbourn, let's talk about why NATO matters today. And I see this quote that is often talked about, and that is what the first Secretary General of NATO said, that the purpose of it is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Is that still the mission of NATO?
Well, I hate to be a classic historian and a bearer of bad news. This is why people don't invite us to parties. But that quotation from Lord Ismay is actually apocryphal. It's off-cited, but never actually in the historical record.
Oh, no.
I know. I'm sorry.
I'm glad you told them and I didn't have to.
You know, it's the obligation of a historian to occasionally put a damper on a party conversation. But it endures because it seems to describe so well so much of NATO's history. So if you think about the Cold War, of course, a critical part was to keep the United States engaged in Europe, to make sure that the United States didn't do as it had done in the First World War and turn its back on Europe, right? That it had disengaged from the continent. There's no doubt that much of NATO's Cold War was about keeping the Soviet Union out. And of course, there were complicated arrangements to try and keep West German power useful and palatable in service of an allied cause, as opposed to repeating the tendencies of the German past from unification after 1870, 1871. Now, that story has always become a little bit more fuzzy in the post-Cold War years. Once the Berlin Wall came down and then the Soviet Union collapsed, you have rounds of soul searching about to what extent NATO is still required to fulfill any of these functions, to keep the United States in Europe, to keep the Russians out, to keep the Germans down. These various components have always been up for debate. And we can see that in conversations about other roles that the alliance might take on, whether it was NATO's involvement in the war in Afghanistan or recent conversations about whether NATO should pivot to meet the threat from China or from climate change. So we've had this sort of ebb and flow in the post-Cold War period about what NATO is really for. But since February and Vladimir Putin's renewed invasion of Ukraine, and I strongly want to emphasize renewed invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot more conversation that returns to familiar patterns about the threat posed by Russia to European security and what NATO can and should be doing to ensure that Russian expansion does not move further west on the continent.
But I think, Jeff, you would agree that NATO is really there in response to Russian potential aggression to Europe. Is that correct?
Well, I think I'd go back to what Susie said to say that there's always been overlapping reasons for NATO. Obviously, the primary, the titular, the headline reason for why NATO was created in 1949 was, of course, to find some way to create a security framework to guard against Soviet incursion. And yet, it's also been remarkably useful for helping the United States integrate its own security forces with other European allies. Frankly, it's been very useful, as Susie also said, to keep the Germans, frankly, in line, and the French as well, to some extent. And so ultimately, my argument would be that if NATO did not exist today, we would want to create it, because it really gives a wonderful mechanism already in place after the Cold War and after the renewed invasion of Vladimir Putin of last February, gives a wonderful mechanism for extending America's security promises with its allies and security integration with its allies.
So one of the big issues after the dissolution of the Soviet Union was whether or not Russia was a threat. And I think our viewers, especially those who are younger, might be surprised to know that there was even discussion about Russia, what role Russia might play within NATO. Expand on that, if you would, Susie.
Yeah, so one of the biggest puzzles that confronted American policymakers at the end of the Cold War is, how do you provide for security across all of the former Warsaw Pact? So you have states of various sizes and shapes who are all looking to the past, concerned about not repeating the past in many respects, but with very different perspectives. And so the story of the 1990s is really one where both the Bush administration and then the Clinton administration are trying to figure out how to walk a proverbial tightrope. How do you provide reassurance to Central and Eastern European states that they will be safe from Russian power? Something that, say, if you were a Pole, you might feel sensitively about if you had any sense of history. But to do so in a way that would also signal to Russia and to Boris Yeltsin in particular, that you were interested in a genuine partnership, that you did not want to isolate Russia or leave it on the outside of the system. And so much of the diplomacy of the 1990s was two-track. So trying to build up ties between the Central and Eastern European states with NATO, but also to keep Russia within that framework. Now, if that sounds like a complicated diplomatic task, it's because it was. And there were no shortage of difficulties. Yeltsin, for instance, deeply regretted and lamented the degree to which Russia, a great power in his view, was being treated as though it was the exact equal of the Czech Republic or Hungary or Poland. And so there were always difficult tensions to navigate there. But ultimately in 1997, what the Clinton administration tried to put in place was a system where they would strike a new bargain with Russia, embodied in what was called the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which set down a series of ground rules about their cooperation and what European security might look like, while also moving towards a first round of NATO expansion to include the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And really, in that 1997 parallel deal, you can see a lot of the roots of both what we are dealing with today, some of the antecedents to the problems of European security in the tensions between the two tracks of that 1997 decision.
So, Jeff, one of the things that has always puzzled me is, and Susie made reference to the first wave, the first tranche, why were Ukraine and Georgia kept separate? Why weren't they brought in earlier? Because doesn't that give some justification to what Vladimir Putin says now?
2 points in response to that question. The first is that Ukraine and Georgia were both part of the Soviet Union proper. And so I think that they're also further east, if you will, further away from the rest of NATO. So it's really not that complicated to think that if NATO were to expand, you would expand first with the closest countries and expand last into countries that were part of the country that the headline of your organization was designed to thwart. But there's a second part, which I think is really important here to recognize, which is throughout this entire conversation, we're framing this in terms of what the United States did, what its allies did, what NATO did, whether it was our choice to expand. The truth matter is the Russians also had a choice, which was a choice to respond. And we have to remember that this entire security discussion is ongoing at a time when the expectation was that Russia would further integrate itself economically and politically with Europe. At the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of enthusiasm for what Gorbachev referred to as a common European home, that the Soviets would finally say, and then the Russians would finally say, it's been centuries when there's been a question whether or not we're part of Europe or not. Let's answer the question affirmatively for all time. The truth matter is that because of Russian corruption, because of lack of laws and judicial power in Russia, because frankly, the Russian economy wound up being an unstable place to invest, Russia never developed the same economic and political ties with the rest of Western Europe as places like Ukraine ultimately did. So there's a sense in which we can focus on the security of NATO too much. And that's really important. I'm glad we're having this conversation. But let's remember that NATO was only supposed to be, if you will, one leg of the tripod that was supposed to help integrate Russia and Western Europe at the end of the Cold War.
Jeff, I know this will be a challenge because we could take a whole program on this question, but in your book, you talk so much about how George H.W. Bush was really pulled in different directions about how much economic aid to give Russia. Tell us about just how Russia really was on the ropes, and that we even considered giving up to, $20 billion a year in financial assistance.
Yeah, we have to remember the broader context here, which of course is that the Soviet Union is transforming in a way that no country had ever attempted. They were trying to move from a massive, globally influenced, regionally powerful command economy into a capitalist market economy basically overnight. No one had ever tried that before. And even the most optimistic Russian economists recognized that this was going to cause a lot of pain. This was going to cause a lot of unemployment. This was going to cause a lot of discomfort. This was going to cause a reduction in pensions, for example. There was going to be some pain to be suffered. And American policymakers knew kind of had two conflicting problems. They knew they needed to help Russia. Well, first, because it's the moral thing to do. People are starving, we should help them. Secondly, we wanted to help Russia because we wanted to have economic stability, which would lead to political stability, which would be good in and of itself at the end of the Cold War. But at the same time, there was a recognition among American economists that there is no amount of money in the world that was going to keep the Russians from enduring some pain. And however much the United States and its allies, the Germans especially, gave the Russians, it was never going to be enough. So you're going to help, you're going to give a lot of your resources. And at the end of the day, the Russian people are still going to have some bitterness towards you because they're going to say, we surrendered during the Cold War. The United States didn't win the Cold War so much as the Soviet Union surrendered. We surrendered during the Cold War, and now we are hurting. And there simply was nothing the Bush or Clinton administrations, I think, could have done to keep Russia from enduring a great deal of pain. And it's only unfortunate, I think, that the Russians decided not to, if you will, keep the pain going long enough to allow democratic and capitalistic institutions to take root, but instead went for the Putin-esque kleptocracy that we see today.
So, Susie, take us back to the Bucharest Declaration, because I think that's one of the key points that began to escalate the friction with Russia.
Yeah, so you have a situation in 2008 where the NATO as an alliance is considering whether or not to expand another round. So at this point, you've already had a series of rounds of expansion. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joining in 1999, along with a huge round of expansion in 2004, including, but not limited to, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And you'll notice with those last three, I'm talking about parts that the Soviet Union would have considered parts of the Soviet Union. And I use that phrasing very carefully because in the West, it was not commonplace to recognize Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as legitimate SSRs, republics of the Soviet Union, but rather as occupied territories following the Second World War. And so that distinction mattered to a great number of people about whether or not to let the Baltic states in 2004. So all of that is prelude to what happens in 2008. And so at Bucharest, you have, for lack of a better word, a showdown between the United States and two of its major allies, France and Germany, about whether or not to let Ukraine and Georgia move ahead in the process of NATO membership. So particularly the debate revolved around what is known as a membership action plan, always called a MAP. And the United States, the Bush administration, was very supportive of extending a MAP to Ukraine and Georgia. France and Germany opposed for fear and concern that it might aggravate Vladimir Putin, who had already at this point made some fairly famous and oft quoted scathing remarks about US hegemony in the world, most famously at Munich in 2007. So you have this showdown, and what ends up happening, I would describe as nothing short of a boondoggle. You end up with the worst of both worlds, where NATO keeps open the vague promise that there is an open door and any country that is interested in joining is welcome to join when the time is right, while also telling Ukraine and Georgia, no, you can't have a map. And so they leave Ukraine and Georgia in this sort of limbo. And the fact that this was a miscalculation or potentially damaging was clear at the time. If you go back and read commentary from 2008, there were plenty of NATO watchers who were very critical of what this would mean for Ukrainian and Georgian security, something that was immediately driven home by the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008.
Why was this really one of George W. Bush's worst mistakes? Was it a strategic error?
I would say yes. And it is hard to know exactly what unfolded without the historical records. I'm really looking forward to when we get full access to American, French, and German records in particular from 2008. But from the vantage point of 2022, as someone looking at the war in Ukraine, it's very hard not to see that as a huge blunder on the part of the Bush administration. It's not a mistake owned solely by them. NATO has lots of members who all agreed to this, but it is hard not to look at the situation of Ukrainians fighting on the ground and not see some link to what happened in 2008.
All right, so Jeff, why did Bush do it?
Because Bush really believed. He believed ultimately in two things. He believed first in his freedom agenda, as outlined in his 2005 second inaugural address, to say that the United States was going to push hard for the elimination of tyranny and push hard for freedom. I'll note that Bush never defined exactly what tyranny and freedom were throughout his administration. And the second reason was because that Bush believed we could no longer slow down after 9/11. The first Bush administration, the H.W. Bush administration, and to a lesser extent, the Clinton administration, both started from the premise that democracy and freedom were on the march, that the end of history had occurred at the end of the Cold War, that we had finally gotten to the place where democracy was going to win in time. George W. Bush, after 9/11, believed we were out of time, that we had to essentially catalyze the process of democratization, which is why he invaded Iraq in 2003. You know, his father and the Clinton administration would have said during their times, Iraq will turn democratic on its own pace. George W. Bush believed that we could no longer wait. And I think the same can be said for NATO expansion, that as the last months of his administration were ticking by, he wanted to essentially fast track, catalyze, speed up, whatever verb you want to use, speed up American engagement with Europe's future progress and with the integration of those new democracies into the Western fold. Essentially, instead of letting history come to him, he paddled towards it. And I agree with my colleague that I think that this is, from the perspective of 2022, a case where the Bush administration made, frankly, yet another strategic error.
Well, let's jump now to 2022 and see how this sort of evolves. Shortly after Russia annexed illegally, I think we all agree, the 4 provinces in Ukraine, the president of Ukraine then filled out applications to fast track membership to NATO. Do you think that'll happen? And what are the obstacles?
I don't think that will happen anytime soon. And I think that what we are going to essentially get in a similar situation as we saw after 2008 of a promise of Ukrainian integration at some point. But the moment you actually get on that highway, or as Susie said, lay out the map of what day you're going to do what, you run into a fundamental problem with NATO, which is its best virtue, which is the Article 5 Mutual Security Declaration that says that an attack against one is an attack against another. And I would ask anyone to consider, if Ukraine is going to come into NATO, where is the border? And at this point, I can tell you the border is not the same as it was 10 minutes ago. And it's not the same as it was is going to be in 2 weeks, because there's active fighting going on. So if you were to say, just as a theoretical exercise, that the border of Ukraine is the borders before February of 2022, there are Russian troops today in areas of Ukraine before February of 2022. Does that mean that we immediately have to go to war with Russia to defend the territorial integrity of an ally? I don't think that's a good plan. So I think before there's any solution to whether Ukraine becomes a formal, full member of NATO, we're going to have to see a cessation, or at least a long-term pause, as we have in the Korean Peninsula, a long-term pause that solidifies the border.
And this ambiguity makes it so difficult. So, President Putin has clearly said that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. Zelensky has said we must be a member of NATO. Is there some middle ground that negotiators sitting around the table might try to reach today?
The big question is what Vladimir Putin wants. And I don't know if we can confidently answer that question. And I frankly don't know if Vladimir Putin can confidently answer that question. And I don't mean that to be flip, but to say that Russian security interests cut in many different directions. And Putin is thinking at a number of different levels about his own personal security within the regime as the head of state right now, thinking about Russia's long-term economic security, thinking about Russia's relationship with not just Ukraine, but all of its neighbors in the post-Soviet space. It's easy for us right now to talk about Ukraine in isolation because, of course, the Russian war effort is such a focal point right now. But it's not as if Ukraine is the only former part of the Soviet Union where Russia has instigated conflict and has tried to keep conflict frozen in order to have some leverage. So earlier, right, we were just talking about the fact that the Article 5 guarantee is muddied to some degree. That conversation is muddied by facts on the ground. Vladimir Putin knows that.
Well, we have 1 minute left, and I want to ask you both this question. I'll start with you, Jeff. Does the United States still occupy the biggest chair around the NATO table in Brussels? And what should we do?
Oh, yes. And that's absolutely something that every American should want. I think one of the criticisms I would launch against the Trump policy of NATO of trying to debase American security and debase America's relationship with NATO is that he seemed to have forgotten that NATO was designed so that the United States would be the big dog. And I think that we would rather have our voice be loudest in Europe than somebody else's. History says that we at least have less of a chance of making war break out than, let's say, when Germany or France or Britain had to lead. So the United States is still the lead country. And I think the Biden administration has done a tremendous job in trying to rebuild a relationship that was hurt not only by the Trump administration, but frankly, by the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So we're still loud, but not as loud as we used to be.
Susie, I'll give you the last word.
I think there's a real conversation to be had about how durable it is. The United States is, of course, the largest actor at the table right now, but we talk a lot about burden sharing, and there is potential for a distribution of power within NATO to also potentially better serve American interests.
It really is interesting to see where the roots of what we're experiencing now can be really very, very easily seen what happened back in 1989 through 1993. I want to thank both of you for being on the program today. And as always, we're talking about things that matter with people who care.